Good morning and welcome to the last in our series of webinars hosted by City Science on navigating transport decarbonisation. In case you're not already an avid watcher of the series so far, I'm Elliot Reid from City Science, and I'll be chairing this morning's proceedings. In case you don't know who City Science are, we are an SME founded around 6 years ago with a core mission of how you can take a city or a place to net zero. And since then, we've assembled a team of transport planners, data scientists, software developers, and energy specialists spread right across the country, all focused on delivering that mission. So when we originally decided to organise these webinars, we set out the clear goal that we were going to use these to equip transport professionals to be able to address our climate emergency. And so far, we've had two previous webinars. The first one we held back in June was focused on developing future decarbonisation pathways. The second one we held last month was all about technology and innovation and exploring the role that it can play in achieving net zero. If you didn't manage to catch either of those, then they are available on our website via YouTube recording links. I always think that one of the key challenges of the climate emergency and tackling it is that it can sometimes seem very irrelevant and abstract to local people going about their daily lives. So today's session, entitled Local Solutions to a Global Problem, has a laser-sharp focus on how we can deliver meaningful climate transport action and change at a local authority level to achieve their own net zero targets. We've assembled another panel of diverse people with first-hand insight of delivering positive action at a local level. As you can see there on the screen, we've got Kate Morris from Leeds City Council, Mark Vallely at Transport for the South East, Heather Watkinson, our own Associate Director at City Science, and Spencer Powell from LDA Design. How we'll run the webinars, we'll have a short 10-minute presentation from our own Bob Hickish setting the scene, followed by around 10 minutes for each of our panelists to introduce themselves and provide an overview of some of the work that they are currently involved in. We'll then have around 40 minutes or so left for a panel discussion using questions fielded from yourself, which I'll put to the panel. So please can you ensure that any questions that you do want to pose to that panel, you raise them within the question box on the right-hand side in the GoToWebinar software, please. So now I'd like to pass over to Bob Hickish, who will kick things off with his presentation. Over to you, Bob.
Thanks very much. If we could just progress to the introduction slide, please. So thanks very much for the opportunity to talk at this webinar. So as Elliot has previously said, we've had another one where we've set the scene around decarbonisation, and this presentation is to really give a bit of context about the local solutions to decarbonisation and City Science's work in that sphere. So if we could progress to the next slide, please. So the first part of this slideshow is going to be talking about the desire for local change. Next slide, please. So the climate crisis means that there's a pressing need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and in the UK this is backed up by legislation and policy. Thinking about emission sources at an industry level, government statistics show that transport is actually currently the largest contributor to UK greenhouse emissions, as shown by that top left statistic there. We covered this in quite a bit of detail in the first webinar, so if this is surprising to you, then I suggest to go have a look at that webinar. It's available on YouTube. In the bottom left here, we can then see there's a picture of the Department for Transport's Transport Decarbonisation Plan. And this really sets out central government's vision about how it's going to deliver decarbonisation of that transport industry, given that it's a particularly large emitter and is a key to our economy and way of life. So as it says there, place-based solutions are really at the core of central government's strategy for decarbonisation. And so that in turn means local solutions. What are these local solutions going to be delivered by? Well, that's UK local authorities. And so what do they think of local decarbonisation? The statistics on the right here show that a large number of local authorities are taking decarbonisation of transport very seriously. 74% have declared a climate emergency, and 59% have set very ambitious goals. So there's a real desire there at the local level for local solutions. But if we could progress to the next slide, please. But as it says here, although there's a real commitment for change and decarbonisation, for many of us, it's very overwhelming considering how we're going to achieve this, and both at an individual and organisational level. So what can we do to reduce our carbon emissions at a local level? At the bottom of this slide here, we can see City Science's 3 recommended steps for achieving this. First of all, we need to understand our current emissions, and this gives us the scale of the challenge and the key sources. We can then set our interim targets to reach net zero, and this gives us 2 things. This gives us a pathway to achieve net zero, but we can also look back and see whether we're on that pathway as well as time progresses. And then finally, once we've got our interim targets, we can then start to think about what interventions are we actually going to put in place to help us achieve these targets. There's many options, and if we're at a local scale or considering local solutions, these need to be locally relevant to that place. I'm going to talk through each one of these steps in a bit more detail, but I just want to highlight that our Transport Decarbonisation tool, which I will come on to later, is really in place to help local authorities with achieving that final step of putting in place interventions. So next slide, please. So first of all, I'm going to talk around the first 2 steps in that 3-step process that I just mentioned there. Next slide, please. So local authorities decided that they want to decarbonise. As I've said there, it's critical for them, before they can do that, it's critical for them to understand both their current emissions and the potential pathways of decarbonisation which are going to lead them to there. As was spoken about in the first webinar in this series, there's quite a lot of data available at the national level to inform this at a national scale, and also policy documents such as the Transport Decarbonisation Plan that I mentioned before, and the Climate Change Committee's 6th carbon budget, both shown there in the bottom left. However, these are at a national scale, and we're thinking at the local scale. So City Science were approached by England's economic heartland to try and disaggregate these national scale statistics and documents to a local level for the local authorities within that region. And this is a project that we delivered on, and I'm going to talk about a bit more in the next 2 slides. So next slide, please. So the first deliverable was a picture of the current local emissions. We delivered this as an interactive tool. A local authority can select their specific locality using that cell in the top left there in a kind of a pinky color. And then they can see a range of statistics and graphs which give a picture of their emissions relating to the change over time. We've also can see the emissions by relating to different vehicles, and also the contributions of different road network. So importantly, we've got the distinction between major, minor and strategic roads, and strategic roads are not in the control of local authorities. So this really gives local authorities a picture of their current emissions and where they might need to target for reductions. Next slide, please. As well as seeing their current emissions, the tool allows authorities to see potential pathways published at the national scale, disaggregated when applied to what that would mean in the shape of their own local authority. So again, we've got a screen grab here, and the local authority can select their the pathway that they're interested in, that they might have seen in either the Transport Decarbonisation Plan or the Committee for Climate Change's document, and then they can see it in the shape of that pathway within the graph there. Crucially, we've also accelerated some of these pathways so local authorities can see what that would look like if they have a more ambitious plan than the 2050 goal. So that really gives local authorities a bit of a tool to build some understanding around the differences behind these pathways and what that might mean, especially if they compare it against the policy assumptions within those documents. Next slide, please. Next slide again, please. So in the previous slides, I related to understanding current emissions and setting targets, but in this set, I'm going to speak a little bit about how we can plan local interventions and reach those targets. And so this is City Science's Transport Decarbonisation tool. I just want to highlight here that if anyone is interested in this tool or either of these tools, we've included the City Science email address in the bottom right hand there, so people can make a note of it. It's worth highlighting for me right now that there is no one-size-fits-all approach to local interventions that can be applied to every place. This is because the specifics of different types of place can vary substantially. So what might be appropriate in a rural area might well not be appropriate in a highly urbanized area in terms of interventions. And so recognizing this, City Science have helped come up with a complementary combination of services to support local authorities. We have both an online-based tool, which can allow users to see their potential pathways and the effect of different interventions, and I'll speak about that more in a moment. And then we also have a climate workshop, which can really be used to help you plan what interventions can be used in combination to reach a local authority's climate goal. These tools were developed with funding from the Department for Transport, and then we've applied them with Somerset County Council and in the process of England's economic heartland. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot from the online-based tool. As you can see in the bottom right there, I've put the web link there, and it's possible for anyone to log on and see this tool. You might not be able to see it for your local authority, but you can certainly see it for some local authorities. And if you are interested about adding your own local authority into it, I suggest to get in contact. So in the screen grab there, you can see the local authority can be selected in the top right-hand drop-down. And then we can see in the graphs here, we can see the predicted emissions pathway, what we predict is going to happen, and the target emissions pathway in the pink. The predicted emissions pathway varies depending on these controls on the left, and these controls relate to the interventions that we put into place. So these interventions have different policy levers, and so we can affect here the freight quantity, the change in trips, the short journey mode share between walking, cars and public transport, and also the same for long journeys as well. So local authorities can really see what effect changing these parameters are going to have on their carbon emissions and start to explore solutions that might help them get to their climate goal. As well as that, we can also implement different start and end dates relating to the specifics of that goal. Next slide, please. So alongside this, we also have the workshop. So this is a workshop facilitated by City Science, and it involves partners at the local authority and other stakeholders. And in this, we really explore the potential interventions and try to build a consensus around what is workable in that local authority, and then also using the tool that I've just shown to you to evaluate the effectiveness of the proposed interventions and try to come up with a suite which is going to align with the authority's targets. So as we can see there, we've had some very complimentary feedback from our previous workshop attendees. And yeah, I'll highlight again, there's our email in the bottom right there. So next slide, please. So in conclusion, we can see that many local authorities are committed to net zero. They understand that it's important and they understand that they have the power to help us get there. However, it's difficult to have the equipment and right tools and information to address that challenge. So what tools and equipment do we need there? So to develop net zero pathways, it is fundamental that we need to understand our current emissions and our potential trajectories, so we can start to think about which interventions we might put in place. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet for interventions, which is why it's essential to put together a suite. And when putting together that suite of interventions, there's a hierarchy in which we should think about implementing them. So first of all, we want to substitute trips, then shifting modes, and finally switching fuels. This focus on place-based solutions really allows local authorities to plan their net zero pathways, and we offer a range of tools to help local authorities within that process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob. And for those who are just listening on audio, that email address that Bob was referring to is info@cityscience.com. Now I'd like to introduce one of our first panelists. It's Kate Morris. If you'd like to come on, Kate. Kate is the head of transport planning at Leeds City Council. I know you're also on the board of the Transport Planning Society for your sins. So go ahead, Kate.
Thank you, Elliot. Good morning, everybody. As excuse me, Elliot said, I'm the head of transport planning at Leeds. I was just going to give you a brief overview in terms of what we've been doing at a local level. Luckily, it's consistent with a lot of what Bob's just said. That's always the danger of coming after somebody when you've not seen their slides before. So if we move on to the next slide, I think what I wanted to do was just a bit of context in some ways. So we were one of the local authorities that declared a climate emergency in 2019 and signed up to net zero by 2030. As part of that, we actually then set up the Leeds Climate Commission, which is a collective of Leeds City Council officers and members, local further education establishments, private sector. And actually in the handouts, I provided a link to the work that we've done around the roadmap. I think the reason I wanted to put it there was just to emphasize, although we're talking about transport here, we have to look at it in the round in terms of, obviously, if we're talking about electric vehicles, well, where is that electricity coming to charge our vehicles? If we're advocating that people work at home more, so we get the saving in terms of that transport journey, how they heat their own house is critical in terms of achieving this overarching net zero target. So if we move on to the next slide, in Leeds, we'd started a conversation around transport in 2016. We had over 8,000 contributions to that. So we were already starting to think about what we wanted to do in a transport perspective. Obviously, then the climate emergency declaration focused that. And what we've been doing is working on our transport strategy. So at the moment, it's in draft format. We consulted on that at the beginning of this year. We've now received that feedback, and actually we're going to our executive next week to get that ratified for full publication. So I was going to just walk through some of the key elements of that. So you see we've put here very much a vision which is around the city being somewhere where you don't need a car. I think it's very important we recognise that there are still some journeys that need to be made by car, but this whole ethos of what we're trying to achieve is that there is an alternative to people to make that personal choice to travel more sustainably. And what we've done is we've then hung our transport strategy around 3 different elements in terms of it's addressing tackling climate change, it's around inclusive growth, and it's around improving health and well-being. So if then move forward onto the next slide, what that's meant is that we've articulated the targets, therefore, that we are looking to achieve over that period up to 2030. So kind of mapping out what that looks like in terms of the mode shift that we want to achieve. And obviously some of these are quite challenging in terms of doubling rail, increasing bus by 130, compounded, I think, by the uncertainty that we're all facing in terms of what's been happening through the pandemic. But I think importantly, what we're also saying is that we want to reduce car distances on the network by 30%, probably in the background of increasing car usage, maybe going forward, you know, kind of reflective of kind of some of the uncertainties with the pandemic. So what does that mean in terms of for 2030? You'll see there that that is kind of our aspiration in terms of our mode split. So then if you move forward onto the next slide, what does that mean? How have we tried to then articulate what it is that we want to do to actually the people that will affect that change? So we've kind of clustered that round 6 big moves. For us in Leeds, the city centre is a focal point. You know, kind of we're not dealing with just people coming from our own local authority. Leeds city centre attracts trips, you know, across the whole of West Yorkshire and beyond. So actually what we do in the city centre is fundamental in trying to establish those changes to travel behaviour. Key element is around enhancing public transport. There's obviously a lot of work going on around there, reflective of kind of the mayoral declaration in West Yorkshire around bringing buses back into public ownership, what's going on at the moment around the bus service improvement plan, enhanced partnerships, franchising, the works. You know, kind of, obviously we're talking today about that decarbonisation of transport. You know, it's very much around creating a place, healthier streets, a community, embracing new technology. And then one of the things that we're looking at from a West Yorkshire perspective is actually a mass transit network. So if you move forward again on that, I think it's relatively easy for us all to come out with a strategy, but actually the real barometer is how we are going to achieve this. So what is the action plan that we sit around that? And that's something that we are looking at and developing at the moment. Because I think it's such a period of uncertainty, what we're trying to do is although we've got that aim of achieving for 2030, we're breaking it down into kind of 3-year sections. We will review how it's working, monitor it, and then look to refine the next 3 years. But what we've done is frame that around 4 different themes. The first one being policy development. So how we actually look in terms of reallocation of our road space, the policies we have around safe and sustainable travel, this key element about the link between transport and land use funding, land use planning. And then the real thorn in the side in some ways is actually the funding and where the money's come from to implement what we want to do. The hard infrastructure on the ground, so that might be bus priority, park and ride, cycle lanes, that physical infrastructure. Then actually the third one, which I think is one of the biggest challenges, and I'll touch on it at the end in some ways, is around kind of the mobility and the service and behavioural change, how we can provide that integrated transport offer, and actually the opportunities around kind of shared mobility. And then I think lastly, and this is something that is very much at the forefront kind of when you get down to a local level, is actually how we manage and maintain our current network. It's all very well building lots of shiny new things, but actually if the current network doesn't work, and this is what we get involved in a lot at a local level, is actually our elected members coming to us and people on the ground complaining about potholes down their road, you know, kind of the maintenance issues, rather than maybe the larger strategic things that obviously we're talking about here. So if I just move then on to the next slide, you know, we've done a lot already in Leeds, and this, you know, I could talk probably for the whole of the session around what we've done, but the next two slides, I suppose, just give a little bit of a flavour of that variance. So we were lucky enough to get a significant settlement from DFT, which was around our kind of local public transport intervention that we could do, and kind of with public sector match funding, we had over £200 million to spend, and we're just getting to kind of the tail end of that. So this enabled us to do some really significant strategic bits of work. So this is our Sturton Park and Ride site, which is just off the M1. It's 1,200 spaces, but I think more importantly, what we've been able to do is this has a dual use in terms of actually through the provision of solar panels on the canopies that you can see here, we actually generate more electricity than we need in terms of running the park and ride station. So actually what we're doing is we are a net producer of green energy. So it has a dual use in terms of that decarbonisation. Now that comes with an expensive price ticket of something around about £38 million. So I think then if we move on to the next slide, it's a little bit of, well, what do we do at the grassroots level as well? And I think a key challenge for us is actually how we get that lifestyle change, that behavioural change for people to make not only the major changes to their journey patterns, but also those smaller changes in terms of they choose to walk or to cycle for some of those local trips. So we do a lot in Leeds as well around bringing that right down to a personal level. We've got a campaign around kind of called Walk It, Ride It. We also have something called Connecting Leeds, where we really try to convey to the people that are going to use the facilities that you know, we're providing that choice for them, that alternative to the car. And really the only way that we are going to achieve this decarbonisation if people on the ground embrace that, make those changes and use those more sustainable modes. So that was all really I wanted to say at the moment. I'm sure there will be lots of other questions that come up. And finally, another thing in the handout is actually a copy of our draft transport strategy that kind of covers in more detail what I've talked about there.
Thanks for that, Kate. And I really liked the personal angle to it as well, and making it relevant for people and how they actually achieve decarbonisation in their lives. So thank you for that. I want to introduce our next panellist now, and that's Mark Galloway. And Mark Galloway is Technical Lead at Transport for the South East, and I believe you're also Chair of the Transport Decarbonisation Forum as well. So over to you, Mark.
Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be with you today to talk about this important topic, which is commanding a lot of our attention at the moment. I'm Technical Lead for Transport for the South East. If we just move on to the next slide. Transport for the South East, just very quickly, is one of 7 subnational transport bodies across England. We've heard about from City Sites about the work they're doing for England's economic heartland, sitting in the middle of that map there. Our role, as sort of set out in legislation, is to sort of identify the key transport infrastructure that's going to help deliver sustainable economic growth across our region. But obviously the decarbonisation angle has obviously now having a significant impact on how we take forward our work programme. And what I want to do today is obviously talk from an STB perspective about how we can support our local authorities in delivering decarbonisation. Now, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan does give us some skin in the game, if you like. It makes specific reference to our role in helping coordinate and facilitate the work of our local constituent local transport authorities in terms of their work on decarbonisation. So at TFSE, as Elliot said, we've set up a regional decarbonisation forum, Transport Decarbonisation Forum, to bring together local authorities and other key partners to facilitate their work in this important area. We've also developed a carbon calculator that enables us to understand, moving forward with our work programme, what the impact of particular interventions, large-scale interventions, is going to have on carbon emissions. And we've also got some work ongoing at the moment on developing those all-important trajectories across the region, which we can then disaggregate to our local authority areas. Other STBs have other good work going on, particularly commend Transport for the North's work on the development of their no-carb tool, which is allowing them to understand the impact of or evaluate the impact of different future scenarios on carbon emissions to take forward their policy in this area. And we've heard about England's Economic Heartland's work that City Science is doing for them. So just moving on to the next slide, just contextually, we've already heard about the vital role that local authorities have in delivering decarbonisation. And this is just some numbers that the Committee on Climate Change have come up with in their 2020 report on the role of local authorities in decarbonisation. That just provides some context as to what local authorities have direct or strong influence over. Obviously, direct control under their own emissions from their own estate, but obviously strong influence over about a third of the carbon emissions within their geography. But we can also still see that there's 65%, according to the Committee on Climate Change, where there's little or no influence. And I suppose, whereas this slide says, yes, we've got, local authorities have got strong influence in an important sector. There's obviously the question about how do we influence that remaining 65%. As we know, we've already heard, local authorities, a majority of them, says 3/4 have declared climate emergencies. And a third of local authorities now have action plans in place to deal with decarbonisation. Just moving on to the next slide. So helpfully, there's quite a lot of work going on in this area. The Committee on Climate Change produced a report in 2020 that I've just, it's on the screen there, about the role of local authorities in delivering the 6th carbon budget. There's also the National Audit Commission's work on the role of local government in delivering net zero. Something I didn't put on there, which is a bit of an omission, is also just to mention the great work that the LGA have done in this space in terms of providing guidance to local authorities in terms of how they deliver decarbonisation, particularly some very helpful work packages on their website, which I'd urge people to have a look at if you haven't already. But just sticking with the Committee on Climate Change, they come up with this nice priority recommendations for local authorities as to what we should be doing. They talk about the 4 Fs, having a framework in place, the role of financing, the need for flexibility and facilitation. So just in the rest of the presentation, I'm just going to talk about the framework and the facilitation aspects of that, because I think those are key areas for particular emphasis that I just want to highlight. Just moving on to the next slide. So we've already got some sort of frameworks coming into place. We heard from the first presentation, but we've got the Transport Decarbonisation Plan now out. And as we've heard, there are local authorities now producing action plans. And there's just examples of 3 of those from within my geography, where both counties and districts and unitaries producing action plans setting out trajectories, how they're going to get to net zero, target dates, and clear action that we're going to take to deliver on those trajectories. We're also told that, and very soon, imminent, it's always imminent, isn't it? And imminent means sort of 24th of December or whenever that is, that the government is to produce a UK net zero strategy. And I think this is a critical piece of the jigsaw, because the one thing it must do in terms of providing an overall framework for how we're going to deliver net zero is joining up some of the activity from each of the individual government departments. So getting that golden thread, shall we say, to have a coherent framework as to how we're all going to go about delivering what is a very challenging area. So I just now want to focus on particularly the Transport Decarbonisation Plan and what that has to say. We heard in the first presentation something about that, so we can just move on to the next slide. So these are the strategic priorities that set out in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. And which there are 6, of which I would suggest local authorities have got a clear role in delivering, certainly on 1, number 2 around decarbonising road transport, 3 how we receive our goods, and number 5, which is the place-based solutions to emissions reduction, which as we heard in the first presentation, is very much where the Transport Decarbonisation Plan sets out what it is that local authorities should be doing in terms of delivering on decarbonisation. So let's just delve into that one a little bit more and just see what the Transport Decarbonisation Plan has to say about what we should all be doing in this area. We can move on to the next slide. So here are some of the sort of strategic, under this place-based heading, here are some of the things that the TDP has to say about what local authorities should be up to. So it talks about reform of local transport funding to deliver decarbonisation and levelling up. And the message here is that future funding to local transport authorities is going to follow commitments to decarbonisation. So really interested and quite keen to understand how this is going to be done on an equitable basis. I think one of the key challenges for me moving forward is, unless we're all assessing the impact of the interventions we might be thinking of introducing in our areas on a consistent basis, then how are we going to ensure an equitable distribution of the money that's needed to deliver those decarbonisation trajectories in the future? So I think this is a challenge. We heard about the city science tool. Obviously, in the middle of that somewhere, there's some sort of lookup tables that sort of say, if you do X, this is the outputs you get. But very much for me, unless that's all done consistently, then we could end up with very varying claims for levels of decarbonisation that are going to result from similar policies applied in different places. And I think that could be a significant challenge moving forward. So as it says there, local transport plans will need to deliver an ambitious quantifiable carbon reductions. So clear role for local transport plans moving forward. We've just heard from the DFT that they're going to issue new guidance around the development of local transport plans, which I would suggest the TDP as a prompt for that, as to exactly how this is going to happen. We talk here about the local authority toolkit to be published in 2021, and I'll talk just a little bit more about that in a moment. And a review of how best to represent decarbonisation measures in transport business cases and appraisal. Obviously, a key again, a need for quantifiable ways of measuring the actual impacts of something on the ground and what that's going to deliver in terms of reductions in carbon emissions. I think this is a significant challenge moving forward. And the last one, obviously, decarbonisation principles embedded in spatial planning and transport policy making. So just moving on to this toolkit that is mentioned, if we can just move on to the next slide. Here is the diagram that's included in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan about what the content is going to be and the various areas it's going to cover. And I think we'd all hope that if it's a toolkit, it's going to do some of this work possibly around quantifying the impacts of different interventions in different places to help us as we formulate policy and action plans. I'm not getting clear messages either way from the Department for Transport or the Energy Savings Trust, who are sort of doing some work onto this as to quite what level of quantification there's going to be. So it might be more come out when it turns out it's a bit more of a guidance note than it is a toolkit to help you identify exactly, if you do X in Y location, what reductions you're going to get. I just think the other thing we must sort of say in passing, really interesting dimension that, as you see under the ULEZ and charging scheme banner there, the talk of low congestion charging coming up. I just think it was a bit of an issue that it's only in the context of place-based solutions that the congestion charging is talked about. It's not being referenced anywhere else in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan in terms of the national challenge that there is around the possible need for changing the way we charge people for using the roads. But yes, so just moving on quickly in terms of to the next slide. So what, as we've seen, and this is just, apologies for the slightly garbled text at the in the bottom right hand corner, that should just say local target. This is an example I lifted from a district council's action plan in my geography. I didn't want to name them, but this is the sort of thing, obviously, that we're seeing happen. Is that local authorities are setting targets, trajectories, identifying trajectories. And what we can see here is that this particular local authority has it's used the scatter tool, the Tyndall Centre scatter tool, to sort of identify some potential trajectories, but has actually gone with a more ambitious 2030 trajectory than the sort of scatter recommended pathway. But this is the sort of situation, obviously local, this in particular is a district council, and the pathway that's been identified there just relates to the local authority's own emissions. It's not talking about the borough-wide or emissions. This is just a pathway that relates to just their own estate. And I think this is one of the issues, that having declared climate emergencies, developing action plans, local authorities all declaring net zero dates ranging from 2050 to 2030, but very different scope as we hear for those end dates. Some relate just to the local authority's estate, others looking more widely at their county-wide or borough-wide emissions. So just moving on, just quickly to the next slide. So I've talked a little bit about frameworks. I said there were 4 F's. Just quickly on the financing and flexibility, just to cover those off before I move on to facilitation. Obviously, financing, the plea for the need for resources for local authorities to be able to go about delivering on their action plans. Call to government there for the funding that's going to be needed to deliver. And flexibility, I think obviously the need for local authorities to identify their own trajectories with various end dates to, obviously each place and the geography of each local authority very different, so the need for flexibility in terms of identifying the trajectories that the different local authorities want to follow, and also flexibility in terms of the policies that they will need to implement. There's no one size fits all that can be rolled out universally across local government. So just want to finish on the facilitation thing, because I think this is an important thing, and Heather very much picked up on this. So just moving on to the last slide, penultimate slide, I think. The need for conversations. We very much sort of, in terms of action planning, producing plans and action plans, but it's clear in order to deliver on the decarbonisation piece that we're going to have better conversations with our local communities, with businesses, and with local members about this subject, because there are some very significant challenges coming up in terms of delivering on decarbonisation and the behavioural change that's going to happen, not just within transport, but across the whole decarbonisation piece around the way we heat our homes, the amount of resource we consume, what we eat even, is, as we hear, are all challenging things. So this need for local engagement, and I think local authorities obviously have a key role to play here. This is what they do, is have conversations through local members, through officers, with their local communities. And this is going to be a key part of the decarbonisation piece moving forward. But we need the resources to be able to do this. So we need the people to be able to go out and have these conversations to help local business, the local communities understand what is planned, for them to participate in the development of the action planning, so that it's a participation and consultation rather than just sort of talking at them about this stuff. And just finally, just quickly, just in terms of something to help move those conversations on, just the last slide is just a bit of a plug for the CREDS tool, which we had some involvement at TFSC in helping them to develop this, which is a place-based carbon explorer, which I urge you to go and have a look at if you haven't already seen it. And the reason I'm sort of plugging it here around the facilitation piece is that what it does is it produces carbon footprints down to LSOA level, so quite small scale, 1,500, typically these areas having a population fit, and it allows you to see it's very, very sophisticated. It allows you to see how the carbon footprint is made up, from the various sources, including transport, And this is the sort of thing that would enable, I would suggest, facilitate conversations with local communities around action planning, around the need for decarbonisation, not just of transport, but some of the other sectors where there are challenges, particularly the home heating. So I'll just finish there with that plug, and back to Elliot.
Thank you, Mark. And yeah, lots of key themes there to unpack, and I think we can try and address those in the upcoming panel discussion. I'd like to introduce Heather Watkinson next. Heather, if you want to come up on the screen. There we go. Heather's an associate director at City Science, but you were most recently, you joined us from TfL, and you have experience of delivering action on the ground like the ULEZ that Mark was talking about. So over to you, Heather.
Yes, thank you, Elliot. So I've been at City Science for about a month, and I'll be leading on road decarbonisation. And as Elliot said, prior to coming over to City Science, I spent over 11 years working at Transport for London, and I've worked from the strategy side, but also on delivery of all of TfL's big schemes, essentially. So most recently, I was working on the ultra low emission zone, which is going to get extended to inner London in about 10 days. I've also worked on changes to the congestion charge and changes to the low emission zone. So both those schemes were introduced before I started at TfL, but these schemes are continually evolved. In terms of like the impact of these schemes, so we were keen to focus on some big schemes because that's where you have your big impact. So if we look at the ultra low emission zone, it's not yet been introduced to like a bigger geographic area to inner London, but it was introduced to central London in 2019. And after 1 year of operation, it reduced NOx in central by over a third. So it, big tick against its key goal, which was to improve air quality. It also helped reduce carbon emissions by 6%. If we look at the impact of the congestion charge that was introduced way back in 2003, it's obviously still operational. In the first year of operation, the congestion charge, like big tick against its key goal, which was to reduce congestion, it reduced that by 30%, but it also had lots of secondary benefits. So it helped reduce vehicle kilometres by 34%. It helped improve air quality, both NOx and PM emissions, and we saw a big reduction in carbon, around a 16% reduction. In terms of what it takes to introduce these big schemes, obviously you need strong political leadership. You need, they're not easy to introduce, so you need a big commitment politically. You need to be really clear about what they're trying to achieve. So for the congestion charge, as it says on the tin, really, it was about reducing congestion. For the ultra low emission zone and the low emission zone, they've been principally about improving air quality. So that, it's about getting the public to understand what we're trying to do. Obviously, you need to do, as the previous speakers have said as well, we need a lot of engagement and consultation. So people, we take people on the journey, we get them brought into what we're trying to achieve, and they're clear about what these schemes, what impact they're going to try and have. And I think another key thing is mitigation measures. So when TfL introduced the congestion charge zone, there were quite a raft of exemptions and discounts for residents. More recently, with the introduction of the ultra low emission zone, we were aware through the equality impact assessment that it might have some unforeseen impact on small businesses, low income households and disabled households. So the Mayor introduced a scrappage scheme, which I kind of led on the policy development of. So I think it's really key, we understand, I guess, the whole package of how you introduce successful schemes. Obviously, these are all schemes that other cities could look to replicate. So we're seeing other cities looking to introduce clean air zones. And obviously, I'm really excited about Oxford looking to introduce a zero emission zone. So I've focused on the big schemes because that's where you have your big impact. But there's obviously a raft of, smaller interventions that local authorities could look to use. For instance, installing electric vehicle infrastructure. There is government funding to do that, and you also can access match funding from charge point operators or other private sector partners, for instance, supermarkets, and that's something at TfL we were looking, we were harnessing other forms of funding on top of the government funding. And I think something else local authorities can look to do is how you can use your kind of buying power. So just before I left TfL, I worked with the Metropolitan Police, the Fire Brigade and TfL, and we got commitment for all freight and servicing vehicles to our buildings to be zero emission from 2025. That was obviously focusing on the smaller vehicles, so vehicles under 3.5 tons, because that's what's feasible. But I think there are a whole raft of interventions that we can be looking at. The big schemes have the big impact, but let's not forget what we can do with some of the other levers as well. So just in conclusion, like we know local authorities are committed to net zero, they've got their pledges, but I would really love to see more action at a local level. And just kind of reverting back to what Bob outlined, I think there's 3 steps. The first step is kind of having a look at what interventions are available to local authorities. The second is obviously considering what's relevant to your locality. And then the third is about prioritising, and that's where there's the tools, for instance, the decarb tool that City Science offer that can help local authorities with that prioritisation process. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Heather. And yeah, I'm sure we'll touch upon those in the later panel discussion as well. Finally, and last but not least, I'd like to introduce Spencer Powell from LDA. And Spencer is going to touch upon some of those kind of place-based transport decarbonisation solutions. He partnered with us on research we did earlier this year with the RTPI. So over to you, Spencer.
Thanks, Elliot. So yeah, I'm going to talk about a project we worked on with City Science for the Royal Town Planning Institute last year, looking at the role of planning in achieving net zero emissions from transport, and specifically considering this in the context of the proposed zonal planning reforms at the time. The key driver sitting above all of this was the Paris Agreement and the Climate Change Act, which obviously commits us to net zero emissions by 2050. And we're obviously way off where we need to be to meet that target, particularly in terms of transport, where emissions in the UK have declined by less than 3% since 1990. And I think the view was that despite planning policies encouraging the use of sustainable modes, the approaches of the past 30 years haven't worked, and there often hasn't been much overlap between local plans and transport plans. Initiatives to encourage mode shift often haven't been monitored to understand their success, and crucially, the carbon impact of new developments, of which transport is the biggest part, still isn't modelled, or at least not consistently, as Mark pointed out. So these are obviously very big problems that set some of the context for the project. Next slide, please. But our start point for undertaking the research for the RTPI was also that transport decarbonisation needs to be seen in a wider context, and show how it can be a catalyst for better place outcomes and positive change in other policy areas. And the brief was born out of the DFT's consultation at the time on the brief for the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, because obviously it hadn't been published at this point, which specifically set the theme that the role for people and places would be crucial as we consider where and how transport contributes to greenhouse gas emissions and how to maximise the benefits of decarbonisation for all of society. So that, combined with the proposed planning reforms, were really two of the big policy moves at the time that framed the project. And they led us to consider some additional drivers beyond transport decarbonisation, such as the role of decarbonisation in creating safer and healthier streets, addressing spatial inequalities related to mobility, improving air quality, and creating much more resilient communities whose success, where success and quality of life aren't dependent on private car ownership. And the project, I think, it took place against the backdrop of COVID, and I think the experience of lockdowns illustrated some of the negative consequences of our current approaches to transport on place, or certainly the legacy of previous approaches that we're trying to change now. I think I remember in the early days you had people sort of in city centres confined to their homes, but not really able to access sufficient parks or green space for their daily exercise. And then you had people living in rural and suburban areas that couldn't access COVID testing centres when they had symptoms, or couldn't go out and buy groceries because they didn't have the facilities available locally and they didn't have access to a private car. So I think those disparities and inequalities were already there, and there's plenty of research on that. But it took lockdown to demonstrate how inadequate some of our places are in meeting people's needs, and transport mobility are a key part of that. So next slide, please. To quickly summarise our approach, and the main report is actually in the handout for this webinar, and you can also view the full set of outputs on the RTPI's website if you just Google RTPI Net Zero Transport. But to quickly summarise our approach, we created 4 fictional places that were representative of different kinds of places across the UK. So a big city region, a regional city, a mid-sized town, and a village in a prosperous rural county. And we made some assumptions around these, drawing on data from real places. We then worked with stakeholders, and we were working with Vectos as well on this, working with stakeholders to consider about around 40 interventions to reduce transport emissions and deliver on wider placemaking objectives. And City Science then modelled the sequential impact of a range of those interventions to consider what it would take to reach an 80% reduction in transport emissions by 2030, which is what the science-based target says is required to be consistent with the Paris Agreement, because transport is so far behind the curve on decarbonisation. And we work from the premise that we should first be looking to reduce the need to travel in the first place through substituting trips, so for example through more local and digital living. Then we looked at ways to get people to shift to active and shared modes instead of using a private car. And then finally, for journeys that had to be made and that couldn't be done via active or shared modes, getting people to switch to alternative fuels, and most obviously using EVs for journeys. And the full list of interventions that we considered are at table 2.1 on page 11 of the main report in the handout. And I don't want to dwell too much on the detail of this slide. I think the 2 key points I want to draw out are that under a do-nothing scenario, transport emissions from new development will continue to rise by a further 7% by 2030. And the second is that the modelling showed that even following the sequential approach and making some quite generous assumptions around the likely impact of different interventions, and not least that all new development is zero carbon, which obviously isn't the case at the moment, then we'd still be reliant to a large degree on EVs unless we can significantly reduce travel demand or increase active public and shared transport usage significantly above what's previously been possible. And the more reliant we are on EVs, then the less successful we're likely to be in realising some of those wider place benefits of decarbonisation. And I know Elliot and City Science would be very happy to talk about the modelling in more detail. Next slide, please, Elliot. So we suggested that in order to make this leap from a high carbon, high gas society, we needed to move away from the approaches that simply encourage change while preserving and mitigating impacts on the status quo, and instead move to a more radical approach that actively challenges the status quo and aligns transport and spatial planning to achieve better place outcomes. And that could be done through a zonal approach of zero carbon growth, underpinned by a positive vision for how decarbonisation can be a catalyst for change within different places and communities. And again, I stress this was undertaken at the time when the government was fairly clear-eyed on its moves towards a zonal planning system, which is now much less certain. But this figure here just shows some of the core spatial planning principles of this approach to facilitate local living, trip reduction and sustainable mobility within and between settlements. And at the heart of the model is the principle that place-based solutions to net zero transport should be the key determinants when zoning land for development or protection through the planning system. And this principle was reflected in 3 key concepts: the carbon negative growth zone, the low carbon renewal zone, and strategic green infrastructure. And the core planning principles were that firstly, new growth and development, such as urban extensions, garden towns and villages, should be planned, designed and delivered on the basis of achieving carbon negative growth. And that meant that development should not only deliver net zero transport outcomes from day one, but should contribute to carbon reduction on a wider scale through reducing travel demand, enabling mode shift and facilitating switch to cleaner fuels on the wider network. And while this research focused on net zero transport, we obviously assumed that actually you'd be applying that principle to all aspects of development. Secondly, it showed that urban renewal would be essential to reduce existing travel demand and to redesign existing streets and spaces around active and public transport. And we suggested that change is unlikely to come about through ad hoc development, but would require a coordinated approach to regeneration, development, and the reorientation of networks around sustainable modes. And then finally, we emphasised the role of strategic grid infrastructure, playing a greater role in achieving net zero transport through improving local access to green spaces, while also offering opportunities for tranquility, recreation, and also creating a stronger link between the productive rural economy and local logistics networks. So next slide, please. So the following slide just shows what a very simple zonal plan would look like if we were planning on the basis of net zero. Can I just check, can you still hear me?
Indeed, we can.
Yeah, we can still hear you, Spencer.
All right. Sorry, yeah, the slide hasn't moved. There we go, sorry. So this is a very simple plan showing what a zonal plan might look like if a zonal planning system was based on the idea of zero carbon. And then the slide currently on the screen just provides a bit more detail. And this is one of the vision plans we produced for Emission in Montshire. And within the report, you'll see it's annotated to illustrate some of the key placemaking benefits that arise from taking a vision-led approach that focuses on a wider set of place outcomes. So, for example, we've got communities retrofitted along 50-minute neighbourhood principles to increase local living and resilience. We've got regional mobility corridors prioritising affordable, reliable public transport and that provide equitable access to services, employment, recreation. We've got sort of local make spaces providing more opportunities for local employment and new business, reducing the need to travel to work. The carbon negative growth zones, so the really strategic area of growth we've located on high quality public transport networks that and they are obviously designed around 50-minute living principles from day one. We've created a link between new growth, large scale growth and surrounding countryside to create renewable energy production and grid upgrades to support that net zero transition and the development of EV networks. Active travel connections through high quality grid infrastructure, also increasing physical activity and providing tranquility for urban residents and habitats to support nature recovery. We're showing sort of out of town retail sites, big box development redeveloped to accommodate net zero emission growth and strengthen town centres, which are regenerated with new homes, work and education spaces to really create sort of much more resilient town centres, particularly in the secondary towns and smaller settlements that I think are struggling, particularly post-COVID. And then we've just got these integrated public transport networks and sort of post-industrial landscapes repurposed and enhanced for sustainable recreation and tourism, and actually creating a link between recreation and leisure and public transport, which is quite often overlooked, but is going to be increasingly important in a world where not as many of us are commuting, or certainly it's much more fragmented commuting patterns and more journeys, a greater proportion of journeys will be for leisure. So obviously solutions will need to be tailored to local areas, and their application will certainly differ. But I think the key point is that you need to take that step back and consider transport decarbonisation not just as a technical exercise, but as one part of a much broader process of spatial planning and placemaking to achieve the best outcomes. And notwithstanding the current uncertainty over the future of planning reform, I think is a message that's not likely to change and ultimately is very consistent with the concept of levelling up, however that's delivered. So if we can just go to the next slide, please. This was just an example of some of the diagrams we included in the report. So you've got the 50-minute neighbourhood and the livable street. And if we go to the next slide, please. Again, this is just the concept of a mobility hub and creating sort of multi-purpose integrated transport networks and local centres. So I'd encourage you to read the report, and there is also alongside it a discussion paper which sets out some key barriers to achieving net zero transport and place-based solutions, which were born out of the discussions we had with our stakeholders, and then a set of recommendations to overcome that. And I think it is encouraging to see some of the work that's happened since is moving in that direction, but I think there's still quite a lot to do. And there's also a methodological appendix published as well, which sets out all of City Science's data assumptions around the modelling. So if you're interested in that, you can view that on the RTPI's website. Next slide, please. This is just to wrap up, really. I think vision without execution is hallucination, as Thomas Edison said, and I think there's lots of great ideas going around at the moment, and I think there's a building consensus on what needs to be done. But I think certainly as a planner, that doesn't always translate to the day-to-day reality of working on projects and the discussions you have with both public and private sector people in actually planning and delivering projects for all kinds of reasons, reflected in the barriers we identified through this research. So I think it will be really interesting to see how some of this now will start to come about and all of the great ideas that we've heard on this webinar. And working with City Science, we've actually been appointed to work on some follow-up work for the RTPI, looking at design codes to deliver net zero and nature recovery, really just trying to focus on some of the aspects of the National Model Design Code, which are maybe a little bit lacking, we feel. So we're hoping that will be published later this year, towards the end of the year. And no doubt, I'm sure Elliot will be in touch with some of you about that. But yeah, thank you, Elliot.
Great stuff, thank you, Spencer. So if we can have all the panelists back on the screen, please, with webcams and microphones on, and we'll get involved into the panel discussion. So the first question I'm going to put to you, Mark, is this. So a 2021 YouGov survey showed that around 70% of people are either worried or very worried about climate change and its effects. However, this report doesn't always transcend an implementation of local climate action schemes, particularly those involving restrictions of eco-movements like LTNs. How can local authorities effectively win the hearts and minds of politicians and the public in delivery of potentially controversial decarbonisation action?
Yeah, I think it's not necessarily the message you're delivering, well, it's important, but obviously the way you go about it. I think the problem that we've had recently with the LTN schemes and the active travel is that they weren't necessarily done in, they weren't participative, but these things were sort of introduced and, just appeared overnight under direction from the government. Here's the money. If you don't take this, you're not going to get an opportunity to participate in this. But as a consequence, it antagonised a lot of people who would be with us in the introduction of those things, simply because it wasn't that they object to what you're trying to do, but it's the way you've gone about it. So I think the key message for me is, you've got to communicate in the right way. It's got to be based on participation and engagement rather than just lecturing people. That's the way forward, and it's got to be very local if you're going to do that. I think the other key trick here is to decarbonisation could sound like a problem, but there are wider benefits, particularly in conversations with our local elected members, to stress the wider benefits of what we're going to achieve. So the health benefits resulting from increases in levels of active travel, pollution reductions as a consequence, possibly reduction in traffic levels, these wider benefits, and also the shift in the economy that we're going to need to see, the opportunity for levelling up as part of that. The green revolution we hear about, the re-engineering of the economy. There are opportunities that present themselves. And I suppose the other doom kind of aspect is, what are the consequences if we don't do this? We don't take action. I think we need to, I think we can start to see for ourselves already from what's just been happening globally with the weather in the last year or so. Some of the events that we've seen about what potentially the future might look like if we don't take action. And that's not where we start, but I think that it's really important to have that conversation about yes, taking action is difficult, but the consequences of inaction are potentially catastrophic.
Heather, do you want to add anything to that in terms of how we engage and participate local people in that process?
Yeah, I think it's also not just about engaging, isn't it? You've got to listen and adapt. So kind of at TfL, when we've developed schemes, when I was there, it's, you might have some broad principles, but you've got to listen and adapt and evolve your scheme based on the feedback you've got. So I think it's also about showing you are listening and responding and potentially mitigating any kind of undue impacts. So it's got to be done and done well. But yeah, it's critical, obviously.
Anything to add to that, Kate, from your experience?
I mean, I'd echo exactly what's been said. I think the speed of implementation was a key barrier. I think what I see a lot of the time is some of the things that we're up against is the directive that's come down around the constraints around the funding, and that then in some ways directly affects the way that we're able to do things, the speed that we're able to do things, and also maybe certain elements of it. So for instance, maybe not the ATNs, but we were progressing a CAZ, but it was linked very much to specific funding around a certain element of it. And that, I think the real request from us is devolve the funding, give her that greater influence, and actually then we can go at the speed locally. And it's very much around bringing local communities with us. And I think then by default, the politicians come with you because they listen to their community, they represent their community. And this has to be a cross-party agenda. You've got to try and remove the party politics from it, and that everybody is moving in the same direction.
Anything else to add to that, Spencer?
No, I mean, I'd agree. Sorry, I'd agree with everything that's been said, really. I think one of the key things we heard certainly from the public sector stakeholders we had, was that sort of sense that they wanted to, many of them wanted to go further and faster, but they didn't feel that they had the funding for it, and they didn't feel they had the political backing, I think. And certainly as far as the planning process were concerned, many of them that were looking to put some more ambitious policies in their local plan, for example, actually were worried that they wouldn't be able to do that, because if they did, it wouldn't get through examination, and it could torpedo a local plan. And they were coming under so much pressure to deliver on all these other priorities, not least around housing delivery, that ultimately in that pecking order, when you're putting that time and investment into policy formulation and developing a local plan, you know, you don't want it to fail at the last. So you focus on what's most important, what's perceived most important at a political level. So yeah, I agree. It just requires more funding, and I think more local control and empowerment to do what's needed at the local level.
Great stuff, thanks. So I just want to build on that theme of listening, Heather, that you picked up on there by posing this question, which we've had from the audience. It asks, how can we get politicians to listen to the whole community and not just the noisy minority, for example, opposing cycle lanes and LTNs, who will oppose these changes with or without prior consultation? So over to you, Heather.
So how can we sorry, say that again. Sorry.
How can we get politicians to listen to the whole community and not just the noisy minority who will oppose potentially positive climate action like cycle lanes or LTNs, for example?
Yeah, I guess again, that's why, you know, consultation processes are about engaging with everybody. So I think that's why they're essentially fundamental, and making sure in that consultation process you are trying to get everyone's views so it's not skewed. So I think that can be managed through a kind of a good solid consultation process. I guess as like policy people as well, you need to kind of have clear briefs and be, you know, if you've got the political commitment to net zero, then fundamentally they must understand they need to do action. But I guess it's, you know, the role of policy teams, isn't it, to kind of be that buffer, to remind of what's been committed. And, you know, and I think this is where there is a raft of interventions, and I think this is where like the place-based solutions is key, because, you know, you're not being forced to do any one thing. We know you need to take a multitude of approaches, so I think you can tailor your approach. I think fundamentally though, we need to be seeing more action, don't we? So I think to me that's the key thing. You know, there's this raft of interventions, there's a 40 that come up in the RTPI report, like which ones do you choose to pursue? And also kind of looking at the prioritizations, which ones are going to have the biggest impact.
Great. Anything to add to that, Kate, from your experience in Leeds from a political will point of view?
So I think don't underestimate actually the implication of the political dimension, I suppose, in some ways, and they are very much our taskmasters. And I think, you know, the vocal anti-car lanes or whatever else, that there is a reason for that. And I think that at the moment, I think there still isn't a recognition of the emergency around climate decarbonisation with respect to maybe the counter arguments to these things in terms of economic growth, in terms of all the other sorts of things. And so, you know, kind of the politicians have to listen to what people are saying. They you know, as it was touched on by Heather, you know, maybe the things that are more important to their constituents are housing or the business growth, and actually decarbonisation transport is a little bit lower. So how do we raise it such that those discussions are on a more equitable level in some ways? And I think that's a real challenge in terms of the prioritisation.
I think though, I think the other key thing is that most schemes, like all the TfL schemes, had lots of secondary benefits. So I think that's where we can acknowledge like climate emergency isn't everyone else's priority, but maybe some of the secondary benefits are. So I think that's where we need to capture all the benefits of what we're trying to achieve. Like, is it improving health, you know, reducing costs to the NHS? There should always be something that is going to engage with everyone. And so it's, I guess, you know, presenting things in the round. Even if climate change is the, you know, the driver, there are other benefits to kind of all these interventions.
But I don't think we've got to the mindset where people are willing to make a bit of a personal compromise for the better good, have we? And that's where it's all about hearts and minds, isn't it? And maybe we got to that round the, or we're getting there around the discussion and the dialogue around plastic or whatever else. But I still feel we've got a long way to go in terms of people taking personal ownership around the fact that actually some of the things they need to do might actually, you know, be a greater distance they've got to do, more time or whatever else.
Yeah, I mean, we're working on a couple of schemes at the moment, and one quite big one in particular for sort of new garden village size settlement, and it's very interesting going into that. I mean, there is a local climate emergency has been declared and a biodiversity emergency. There's very strong political backing for getting to net zero, but the conversations are already around the facts of what about cars. One of people's priority is that the new development they've seen recently doesn't have enough parking spaces. And you go there and it's just sort of, you know, every house has got a parking space on plot out front, and you know the rear parking courts aren't used because people are just parking on the pavements. And at that basic level, I think I personally think there is a difference in some of this between dealing with city centres and dealing with other areas. And I think none of it's easy, but I think the dial is shifting certainly on the city centre, town centre, regen side. Partly because I think it's just accepted that if you're going to do this stuff, that's the place to start. But also I think demographically, a lot of them are more receptive. A lot of the populations in those areas are more receptive in the first instance. But I think as soon as you leave that kind of city centre environment and start going out to the suburbs and the smaller towns and villages, my sense is that it's going to be a lot harder to not only on a technical level, but also to win those hearts and minds, because it feels like they are very, you know, for perfectly good reasons that people have, that, you know, attitudes and expectations and assumptions about what they want from their home and their place are quite ingrained. And I think we as a profession or professions still aren't really talking to a lot of those people at the moment. We haven't found a way to talk to people and get those secondary benefits across.
Yeah, I think a model that some local authorities are adopting is to set up climate change assemblies, or whatever you want to call them, which from a local politician's point of view, to have a forum where they can hear the debate between the different contrasting views there may be on this challenging topic and help, you know, shape the agenda. I think that's something, I'm not sure quite how they're working. I know a number of authorities that I'd be anxious to sort of hear a little bit more about how they've worked in practice. But I think in terms of providing local politicians with a safe space to hear the contrasting views and hear the debate and then formulate their own action on the basis of that is possibly something that other authorities might benefit from.
So building on that kind of local variation, then obviously we've touched upon in our various presentations how local authorities have quite different future year targets for achieving net zero. Obviously, we know from the presentation that Leeds want to achieve it by 2030. There's various different targets out there, all of which range up to that 2050 government target. How can local authorities achieve net zero in this context, and what role does the DFT have in supporting this? Kate, do you want to go first, given the Leeds context?
Yeah, and I think, you know, from a personal perspective, I do feel the whole issue around cars, EV, petrol, diesel should be parked to one side. You know, kind of the first thing that we've got to do is around the behavioural change. Car should still be the last resort. So I think, you know, kind of we need to push forward very much around that, and that's what we're trying to do in terms of the narrative that we're doing and the dialogue. It isn't go out there and just buy an EV car and everything will be fine. So I think that is very much, I think in terms of how DFT can then help in that, I think it's setting national policy, as I said, that helps us get the political buy-in that is cross-party, that we've got one voice then around that. It's ensuring that we have funding in place of the quantum that we need, and actually, as I said, a bit of devolution around that, so we have greater control around a 5-year fund or whatever else it might be in that respect, and to give us proper timescales around developing these things. So I think there's a whole myriad there, but it has to start, I think, you know, with clear national policies around certain things that we seem to be still taking a long time to decide on, and we haven't got that time on our side. You know, we've got to be doing things in the next 12 months, really.
Mark, is there any, from your experience in the subnational body capacity, have you got anything to add in relation to some of your experience?
Well, I think I tried to sort of bring in that out in my presentation. We're not all using a common language here, are we? I mean, you know, local authorities declaring net zero targets, sometimes that relates to their own estate. It doesn't necessarily relate to the sort of the area that, you know, the emissions from transport in the whole of their geography. And that's a far more, you know, that's a far to anyone getting to 2030 net zero emissions from the transport emissions in their entire borough or city or county without some significant national policy levers. I can't see how that's achievable. I can see how a local authority could get its own estate to net zero emissions by 2030 by controlling its vehicle fleet and its heating and all that sort of thing. And I just think that you know, we hear that there's these sort of sound bites about, you know, these target dates, and I would just go back to the big thing, that it's not about the end date, it's about what you emit on the way to the end date. You know, this is the key message, that it's about your budget, not about you know, there's these arbitrary sort of target dates that are set. It's about how it's the shape of the decarbonisation curve to that end date that's the important thing. The carbon budget you've got available and how you spend it. So I think there's a little bit of, you know, there's always a need for a footnote. I always like to say, well, is that 2030 date, is that your own estate, or is that the emissions from your entire thing? And I think some of the language here needs tidying up a little bit so that we're all talking about one and the same thing.
Anything to build on that, Heather?
Yeah, I kind of started off my career doing behavioural change stuff, and like personally, I think we need policy levers to force people to change their behaviour. I think if we depend too much on behavioural change, we're not going to achieve anywhere near as much as we need to, and definitely not at the scale. So I think that's kind of why the kind of big schemes TfL have introduced, I find exciting, because we can see tangibly that you get your big impacts from those kinds of things. So I do think there should be a big focus on big interventions, big schemes. And I think in terms of what we need from the DFT, we need the funding to support local authorities to do that, and more direction from them as well, because they kind of, it's all a bit high level, isn't it, what they want from local authorities. I think we could get a bit more clarity and kind of driving from the government about what they want from localities.
I would just come back in and just say one thing, that going back to this conversation piece, one conversation that needs to happen at a national level is this whole issue about the future, you know, the way we charge people for the use of the road network, for two reasons. You know, petrol fuel duty is, as we know, is 28 billion. It's going to crash if we, or that's going to, over time, will erode as the number of EVs increases. So that's got to be replaced. But we also know that you know, this reliance, and very much the way the Transport Decarbonisation Plan was sort of angled, don't worry, if we all shift to EVs, technology's here to save us. You know, problem solved. And we know that that isn't true, that there's going to have to be some reductions in the level of travel demand because of this carbon budgeting issue. We can't wait. The emissions from the vehicle fleet as of now are contributing to the potential increase in global temperatures. We can't the EVs coming on stream 2030 and the uptake of EVs is, we need action now to actually start reducing our transport carbon footprint. So we need this national conversation about the future of the way in which people are charged for the use of the roads. And it needs to start quite quickly, because as the uptake of EVs increases, if we haven't got a replacement system in place, that conversation gets harder and harder and harder as time moves on, as more and more people are affected by it. So that debate and this need nationally for a conversation about this, I think is one thing that I very much would like to see coming forward from the government. Difficult as it is, but I think that's an important step.
So building on that theme and some of the things you talked about, Mark, about the importance of local authorities speaking the same language. The next question is about what tools and resources are available to help local authorities identify the climate action interventions available to them and to prioritise those to achieve meaningful outcomes. And building on that, what specific tools and information would you like to see in the upcoming DFT decarbonisation toolkit that's been promised in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan? I'm going to put that to Heather first.
So about the tools, summarise again.
What are the tools and resources? What are the tools and resources available to help local authorities identify the climate action interventions available to them and to prioritise those?
So I really like the 40 interventions in the RTPI report. I think that's like a really good opener to start having dialogue at local authority level. I think, you need to make sure your policy teams are equipped with some resources to understand the impact of each of those interventions, so you can look to prioritise it. Obviously City Science have got a toolkit. Mark, I don't know if you're just the one you referenced, look at the impact of policy interventions as well. But, we need to equip people, decision makers, to understand not only what the interventions are, but what the impact of them is going to be. And, we know to hit net zero, we need to be doing as much as we can as early as possible. So ideally, we need to be bringing those big interventions in, like road user charging, as early as possible.
Kate, have you got anything to add on that in terms of the toolkit specifically and what you'd like to see out of that?
So I think we as professionals, we all know what we want to do. Actually, the interventions, the list of interventions is not the challenging bit. And I think Mark touched on this, is having a toolkit that helps us understand the impacts at a simplistic level, but on a level playing field to help us make informed decisions. Because we know there's a limited pot. We know we are, unfortunately, in competition a lot of the time, and that's not just at a national level. We're pulling together bids on a West Yorkshire basis, and there is a lot of political discussion as to how you cut and slice that and who benefits, who doesn't, and having a transparent tool that everybody buys in terms of our outcome is around carbon targets, for instance. It helps in terms of those informed decisions, how you split the cake and the quantum of cake that you're going to get. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge we have, is understanding what money we're going to get, how it's going to be split, and the outputs. And kind of, I think also that message back to government, that if you only give us X, we're only going to be able to achieve Y. And at the moment, the scale of the funding we're getting and what we need to achieve, there is just no match at all.
I know, Mark, you talked about the toolkit a lot in your presentation. Is there anything you'd like to add, particularly in terms of Kate's point on funding?
Yeah, I think because well, I could start with the I tried to make the point in my presentation about the need for consistency here. the risk is, we've got, just saying as it is, without the DFT taking a lead on this, the risk is we get lots of different tools that we're all asked to buy that have slightly different engines in them that do things in slightly different ways. That means that somebody up in the north is using this particular tool and someone else is using something else, and then claiming different carbon reductions from broadly similar policies in different places. So there's a bit of a plea for me, which I was hoping was going to come out of the Transport Decarbonisation Toolkit, for some sort of consistent basis for appraising the impact of, at scale, packages of interventions in places to enable us all to shape our LTPs moving forward, to know what, rather than high, medium, low priority or impact, something a little bit more quantifiable to make on which to, with the limited resources we have available, to do that. But I think certainly the work that we've started to do, looking at the packages of interventions we're thinking of coming forward as an STB with at a regional level, when you start to actually look at the carbon impact, you realise, and I think it kind of came out in the presentation that Spencer gave us, that some of the impact you're going to have is from your local stuff in terms of the direction we need to go is not great. You need the heavy lifting from the EV infrastructure, the shift to EVs and the decarbonisation of the freight sector to really get us travelling down those curves, and those are national interventions. But we need, as Heather was saying, we need the money locally to be able to drive forward our local transport plan programs around decarbonisation. We're not given the resources we need for the people that we need in place to deliver those and develop them, then we're going nowhere.
Thanks for that, Mark. And final word quickly, Spencer, to you. What sort of place-based solutions would you like to see in an upcoming toolkit in relation to helping particularly developments achieve net zero from a transport point of view?
I think it would depend on local context and where we are. I think that the interventions we considered through the RTBI research are all should all really be in there to varying degrees. And I mean, there's some you could define some of them in different ways. And I think I know it's been raised the fact that 15-minute neighbourhood principles, how does that work at a rural area? Should we be referring to 1500-metre neighbourhood kind of thing? So I think there's all kinds of interventions you can use, and I'd encourage people to read the report. But I suppose at a strategic level, what I'm really interested in at the moment is what the decarbonisation plan, Transport Decarbonisation Plan, says around integration of local transport planning and spatial planning, because I think at the moment they don't a strategic sort of systemic level, they often don't talk to each other. And I think that's where we end up with development coming through that just locks in high car dependency and high carbon growth, and makes it much more difficult to decarbonise later on. And I think it's unfortunate that, having thought we were going to have some clarity on planning reform, that's now sort of all gone up in the air, and it looks like we're going to be waiting a while longer before something comes out, and it's probably not going to give us the answer that we were hoping for. But I think whatever comes out of that, I think it has to be better integrated with transport planning and with decarbonisation plans at a national and local level, because unless they're all singing from the same song sheet at that systemic level, I think it's going to be really, really hard, and we're just going to end up with this continual sort of piecemeal, fragmented approach. And I think there's one of the aims in there is to create one zero carbon city, one zero carbon transport city. Well, why only one? It's a headline, but we need to be in a position where everything we do is leading to every town, city, village, settlement, becoming a zero carbon place.
Great stuff. Okay, thank you to all my panel. That's our hour and a half up. And just a reminder to the audience, if you want to rewatch anything, or if you miss something you want to share with your colleagues, then the recording of this session will be available on YouTube after we finish up here. But if you do have any questions or need support on transport decarbonisation matters, then reach out to us via our website, or drop us an email at info@cityscience.com. But in the meantime, thanks for joining us, and bye for now.
Thank you.